we begin with comments from our panelists, beginning with Nkosana Moyo, who's Director of Mines. And he's worked across the private sector, IFC, African Development Bank, and I'm sure you've seen this issue several times. So in your opinion, what would be a credible and sustainable framework for dealing with this challenge of unsolicited bids in Africa? And how would you see it working in practical terms?
Thank you, Chair. I think before I answer the question directly, I would just like to put on the table some of the issues we're trying to resolve indirectly as we ask the question, what are the issues on the table? I think the fundamental issue is that we're dealing in a space which is neither private sector nor public sector completely, in the sense that you get private sector entrepreneurs who identify an opportunity. If it was like building a McDonald's, they would just go on and just do it, and you wouldn't have any problems. The problem which arises, however, is that in most of these things, they then want to get public sector underwriting. That's the first complication. The second one is often that the financing is also not their money, but comes from tax dollars from somebody, either from World Bank, IFC, ADB, or the like. So we're dealing in a space where there is a bit of, it's a hybrid. On the one hand, we want the private sector to absolutely come up with their initiatives, identify opportunities, and say, this is an opportunity I've identified. And once I identify such an opportunity, I don't want it to be put in the public domain. In other words, my idea suddenly is being made, given to other people to compete on. It doesn't make sense, because then I might as well not bother. But if I'm going to ask for public sector underwriting, then I open myself up to that complication. So I think the first issue I would say here is what the chairperson was discussing. My view is that Africa as a continent needs to deal with the issue of risk. The reason why the private sector wants that underwriting is because there is risk uncertainty, both commercial and political risk, I may add. And if Africa were to firstly look inwards to demonstrate that that risk as perceived is not real, by using African capital as we began to allude to, you know, there is pension funds, there is money that goes from treasuries that gets deposited offshore, all of this sort of capital which could be mobilized in the first instance to de-risk the perception by outside investors that Africa is too risky, then I think the requirement or the compulsion to want public sector underwriting would also be minimized. So that would be my first point, that Africa needs to begin to look inwards, mobilize its own capital, and demonstrate that we've got confidence when we invest our own money, we won't lose it. In other words, whether it's from pensioners or whoever, then outsiders will have a basis for saying, I can also put my money in without asking for guarantees because it's not warranted. But I think unless we can demonstrate that way, then outsiders are justified to continue to want that underwriting to be put in place. So that's my first point. The second point, which is a bit trickier, is that there is an issue of protecting the consumer. Because we're talking about infrastructure, again, it's not like going and building a McDonald's shop where you just, I mean, if you put infrastructure in place and the tariffs are not properly managed, you can kill your industry, the consumers might rebel, and therefore the politicians may see that they're at risk. So there is also that complication in terms of protecting the consumer. But I believe we can, and I'm going to propose a solution, I think we can deal with that. Then there is the issue of both financial and technical integrity of the project. So we need another body of some kind to assure that irrespective of how the financing is done, there is integrity on those two levels without putting it to competitive tension. How do you deliver that? And I think in addition to Africa de-risking the perception, the only other solution I can think of is a panel of experts of some kind to cover the disciplines which would normally be expected to be deployed in assessing an infrastructure project. If we could find a mechanism of putting together an independent but credible panel of experts where unsolicited bids could then be put through without the need to publicize them for competition, I think that could be a good starting point. That would be my first observation.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.